You should have in your possession How the Bible Came to Us, lesson number 6. If you do not have that, there are some copies out in the foyer on the table. And I brought with me the original edition of the King James Bible, the 1611 edition. Now this wasn't printed in 1611. As you can see, it looks pretty new, but it's printed in the same format. It's basically almost like a carbon copy of an original 1611. I don't know how I want to do this, whether I want to pass it around or whether I want to just set it out there in the back. I'm not sure which way I want to do it, but just try and read about 10 verses of that and see how it goes for you. But I thought that would be an interesting thing for you to look at. Anybody want to take this and start it around? And you can just reach behind you there when you're done and just... But for the rest of us, we're talking about a history of the translation of this lesson, the history of the translations that are made in the English language. Not interested in the other languages right now. Bible's been translated into just about every language on the face of the earth, but we're just interested in the English versions because that's what we speak. So we're just looking at the history of the English translation. I'm sure that in my notes here I've left some things out. I've just given you the top stuff, the main stuff here, but it'll give you an idea of how the thing developed over the years. A lot of people endured a lot of things. Some people were persecuted to death in order to be able to translate the Bible into the English language. We don't sometimes think about that as much as we should. We don't appreciate that as much as we should. The efforts of the reformers. That's what I was trying to think of there. The word I was trying to, that we talk about the Protestant Reformation. The efforts of the reformers to get us the Bible in the common language is to be commended. Now, we know that they wound up doctrinally in a bad place. Understand that. But the sacrifices they made to get us the Bible in the common language should be noted and should be greatly appreciated by us. But we'll start off talking just about, and we did this last week, but I want to get into a little bit more detail. Some facts about the King James Bible, because there are people, I don't think we have that here, but it used to be more common than it is now. There people just think the King James is all there is. And there's nothing wrong with the King James, by the way. If you want to use it, that's great. I used it for many years and then finally switched over to the New King James. Nothing wrong with the King James if you want to use it, if you like to use it. Nothing. I'm not putting it down. I'm just telling you that it's not the only one. It's not the be-all and end-all. It was not the first English translation of the Bible that was ever made. Some people think that it was, and it was not. There were a lot of other translations made before it, a lot of English versions which went before the King James, and we'll talk about some of those tonight. It's not the only translation. Some people say, well, that's the only one. Anything else is a fake. Anything else is a fraud. New King James, bad. NIV, bad. New American Standard, bad. It's all bad. If it ain't King James, it's bad. That's just simply not true. People who say that betray their own ignorance of the facts. That's just, again, if you like it, that's fine. If you want to use it, that's fine. But don't sit there and say it's the only one or it's the best one, because it's just simply not true. There's nothing that makes the King James Version an inherently special translation. It only gained popularity because of tradition, not because of inspiration. Sometimes when people refer to the King James Version, they call it the authorized version. And the reason it's called that is because the translation was authorized by King James of England. And that's all that means. It doesn't mean it was authorized by God. It doesn't mean that God put his stamp of approval on it. It just means that King James commissioned the translation to be made. It's not the best translation either. There are problems. And by the way, there are problems with every translation. I don't care which one it is. Pick one up. Pick any one you want to. Every single one of them has issues. Okay? And the reason is, Keith, made by men.
People's one doesn't translate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the trouble.
Made by men, and men make mistakes, and that's always been true, always will be true. And so every translation has issues with it. Some are much, much, much better than others, without a doubt. King James is among the best ones. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the best. And so it's not the best one ever made. Modern translations, in terms of best, they have more manuscripts. We talked about that in earlier lessons. They discovered all these manuscripts around the late 1800s. And so we have access to more accurate information. You have a greater variety of manuscripts to draw from to try and arrive at that original text, what the original text said. And there have been some revisions because of that, from the older to the newer translations. More manuscripts, better manuscripts, plus our knowledge of these ancient languages has grown over the years. The more we learn about the ancient languages, the better people become at translating it. So that's the reason why new translations are made. Now, that being said, it's not the worst translation either. As I said, it ranks high. It's one of the highest and most popular translations out there, and so it's not the worst either. I'm not putting it down. I'm just putting it in perspective so we can see some facts about it. Here's something a lot of people don't know. The original King James Version has been revised 6 times. Now, I just passed around a 1611. That's 1611. It doesn't read like the one you've got today. If you're using the King James Version today, they don't read the same. And the King James Version has been revised 6 times. I wrote the dates down here. It's revised in 1629, which is really just, 18 years later? 1638, 1762, and 1769. If you're using a King James Version today, you're using the 1769 edition. You're not using the 1611 edition. You're using the one that came out in 1769. That's close to the time of the Revolutionary War. So that's the one that's used today. When you go to the store and buy King James, you're buying the 1769 edition. Even though it might say 1611 in the front, it was revised in 1769. Then there come along, and this was after those manuscripts were discovered, in 1881, the English Revised Version. They discovered all those older manuscripts, and they decided that it was time for a revision. And it's not identified as a King James, but it uses that as a parent text to start, as a starting point, I might say. They use a different Greek text, but they're using the King James. It was a revision to try and get a more accurate Bible. In 1901, the American Standard, now those two translations, the ERV, English Revised Version, and the ASV are essentially the same thing, except one was for England and one was for America. And sometimes the English, if you've ever talked to anybody from England, they don't always talk like we do. We both speak what we call the English language, but their terminology and our terminology sometimes differ. Years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a guy from England. He came overseas and spent some time with us in our factory where we were. And just as an example, you and I would call it a popsicle. You go get a popsicle. You know what they call it in England? An iced lolly. That sounds plumb sissified. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that out loud. But that's what they call. Now, my point is that even though we both speak English, they say things differently than we do. Okay, so so you had the 1881, 1901, essentially the same, one for England and one for America. From that came a lot of your modern day translations, the Revised Standard Version, New American Standard. We'll talk more about that later. New Revised Standard and the American Standard Version. Now, in 1980, you have the New King James, which I like very well for a number of reasons. One of the reasons I like it is it's not so drastically different from the King James that if I'm preaching from it, people don't get lost. You know what I'm saying? It's pretty close to the King James, except it doesn't have the ye's and thous and all of that. It changes it over to modern English. And so for the most part, they're very, very, very similar, okay? So you can preach from it, and most people don't get lost when you're preaching, okay? So I like it for that reason. I also like it for the textual notes that it has. It has some of the best textual notes that you can ever find in any translation. So I like it for that reason. But that came out in 1980. And so that's the New King James. So, notice that 6 revisions of the King James Bible. And the King James Bible was a revision itself. It was a revision of the Bishop's Bible. And again, we'll talk about that Bishop's Bible in a minute. But the King James Version was a revision of the Bishop's Bible. So these are some facts a lot of people don't have any idea about. They don't know that. They just think that God sent down the King James Version directly from heaven. Oh, here it is, right from heaven. And that's just simply not true. And the more we know about this, the more facts we know about this, the better off we'll be. Questions up to this point?
It's in general hard to literally translate any language.
Yes.
Because people, especially phrases, they don't make any sense to us.
Yes.
English-speaking people.
Yes.
And then over time, also, the language changes, just like the word mouse. If we talk about a mouse in 1960, everybody knows what that is, but you bring up the word mouse today, you don't know, is it a computer mouse or a real mouse, or what is it?
Exactly.
So language changes.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you raise a very good point. You know, people say, well, I want a translation that's 100% literal. No, you don't. If you had one that was 100% literal word for word, you couldn't read it. Because when you bring language over from one to another, they have, as you said, they have words and expressions that don't mean a thing to us, just like we have words and expression that wouldn't mean a thing to them. You know, if you went back 300 years ago and you said hit a home run, nobody have a clue what you're talking about. Now today, we know it. Where's that come from? It comes from baseball. Well, baseball wasn't around 300 years ago. So if you said hit a home run to somebody 300 years ago, they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about. So you got to say, if you got a translation that says something about hitting a home run, and you're going to translate that over into another language where they don't play baseball, you've got to figure out a way to get that across. And that's just an illustration. This is true in any language when you go from one language to another. So there's always a little bit of interpretation that's done. There has to be, of necessity, or you couldn't understand it. You wouldn't be able to understand what you're reading. No translation is 100% literal. You want one, I believe, as literal as possible, but it can't be totally 100% literal, and especially not word for word, because as you well know, when you go from one language to another, the word order changes all around. It almost sounds like, to illustrate, it sounds like you're talking Yoda speak. Anybody ever watch Star Wars? You know, Yoda talks kind of backwards. Well, that's the way when you go into a foreign language, the way they phrase things and the way we phrase things are different from one another. So you have to change the word order, and there's a lot of work involved in translating from one to another, but you can't do it 100% literally. It just can't happen. All right, a brief history, number 2 on your list here, a brief history of English translations. These are early efforts that were made way back. You can see there that first one. I don't know if that's Caedmon or Cadman. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. 8th century. So that's 1,200 years ago. So that's a long time ago from our perspective. That's 800 years after Christ. And so he wrote poems of Bible stories. That's an effort to get Bible stories into the common language. It's not a translation. You know, it's like sometimes when you pick up a book at the bookstore and it says Bible stories for kids. And they're taking the Bible stories, put them in a way that kids can understand it, and put it in a book. It's not the literal Bible. Well, here they're taking poems of Bible stories and making poems out of them. So you're getting the message over, but not really a translation. But those are some of the early efforts into English. There's a guy named Bede of Jarrow, 8th century, same time period. He translated a few passages. So these are the early efforts to go into English. Now, again, English as we know it hasn't always been a language. That's why you say, well, why the 8th century? Well, English as we know it hasn't always been there. Languages have evolved themselves over the years. And so you have these other guys that are listed here in line 3. And then line 4, after the Norman conquest of England, this is 1066 AD, they had plays that were based on the Bible. They called them miracle and morality plays. And so they would try and put on a play that illustrated a miracle of Jesus or a moral lesson from Jesus. And so people could see Bible stories acted out. And these are English efforts, so we're not talking about French or German or anything like that. This is right here in English-speaking countries, United States, Great Britain, places like that. Probably not United States at that far back, but definitely not United States that far back, but in the English language anyway, over in Europe and England, places like that. The Roman Catholic view, they had a perspective on all of this. They were not happy about this. They did not want the Bible translated into the common language. Imagine that. Why do you suppose they wouldn't want the Bible translated into the common language? Yeah, they don't want you to know what it says. Let us tell you what it says.
Sorry. They preach false doctrines.
Yeah.
They said if you pay the preacher or the priest for your sins, that they will be forgiven.
Yeah, the indulgences. Yeah, that was one of the things that got Martin Luther started, was the indulgences, yes.
Well, that's what they wanted to keep their power.
Yeah,
They want to keep control.
yeah. Let us tell you what it says. You don't need to have a Bible. You don't need to read that. You're not smart enough to grasp it anyway. It's only for the priests. So let us keep it in our language, and we'll tell you what it says. And that, if you've got that kind of control, you can dictate what people believe. You can control the whole thing, see. And by the way, back then, the Catholic Church was much more powerful than it is today. They put kings on thrones and took kings off thrones. They fought wars. I mean, the Catholic Church was mighty powerful way, way back. And if a pope didn't want you to be king, you wouldn't be king. He'd send his armies out and away you'd go. I mean, that's just how powerful they were at one time. And I don't think we really have a full grasp of just how powerful they were, what a tight grip they had. They killed a lot of people.
They killed because they declared that they was a heretic or whatever false teacher, and they had them killed.
Yeah. Yep, so they're not happy about this. They don't want the Bible in the common language. They would allow it to be translated into Latin, because that was the language they spoke over there among their priests and things. Only the educated could read it, because a lot of people back in these days didn't really know how to read, and especially, if you're an English-speaking person, you probably wouldn't know how to speak Latin, and so it would make it even more difficult. But that keeps people in the dark, maintains the power of the Catholic Church. They claim that doing that would lead to disrespect and error among the people. This by the people who were in error of the Bible and disrespecting Jesus in every way by claiming to be the vicar of Christ. The Pope, his claim is to be anybody know what a vicar is? The Pope claims to be the vicar of Christ. A vicar is a substitute. And let that sink in for just a second. A vicar is a substitute. And so when they say the Pope is the vicar of Christ, they're saying he's the substitute. That's blasphemy. As far as I'm concerned, that's just flat out blasphemy. And nobody can substitute for Christ.
Yep.
So that's just flat out blasphemy right there. And by the way, while I'm on that, over to 2 Thessalonians 2. Verses 3 and 4. And Paul warned about this. He says, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come. He's talking about the second coming. That day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. You couldn't have a more accurate description of the Pope and the position he claims to occupy as vicar of Christ, a substitute of Christ. And it's just, as far as I'm concerned, it's just blasphemy. Absolute blasphemy. All right. So Catholics not happy. So
Talk to tell me that they're still taught that they can't understand the Bible.
I wouldn't doubt that.
And lots of people here in Macon County that are a false religion, so they cannot understand the Bible. And they seriously believe that.
Yeah, no, I know they do. And they're not the only religion that teaches that, but they do teach that you can't, they teach their people, you can't understand the Bible, we have to tell you what it means. Go ahead and read it, but we're going to have to give you an official interpretation, because you're not going to get it right. In plain English, you're too stupid. Okay, that's what they're saying. They wouldn't say it that way, but that's what they're saying. You can't.
They have the right
Yeah.
to make whatever changes all along too.
Yeah.
They have over the years,
Yeah.
and just continue to add and change, do whatever they feel like
Yeah.
they want to do.
Years ago, I thought of this because it connects a little bit. Years ago, I called the Masonic Lodge in Noblesville where I lived, and I asked the guy, I had some Masonic books. I said, can you tell me if these are official Masonic books? Well, what do you want to know for? I said, well, it says in these books that Masonry is a religion. I read it to him. He said, well, it's not a religion. I said, well, it says right there in the books. I said, is that an official book? Well, I can't tell you that. Well, it is. The Kentucky Monitor, I can't remember what, the Tennessee Monitor, there's several of them, but the official Masonic books, and it says right in there it's a religion. Well, and here's what he said, this is why I thought of it. I have to get somebody to give you an official interpretation of that passage, which, by the way, was an admission. Yes, it is one of our books. But I need to get you an official interpretation. You know, I can just read it. It says, Masonry is a religion. You know, you can read it. But no, don't jump to conclusions. We have to get you an official interpretation. So, but it's the same thing, the Catholics. We have to give you an official interpretation.
The Catholic Church has a lot of transgressions, not only in the commandments, but in verses in the Bible where it says forbidding you to eat meat. Like they do that on Friday. When we moved into a Catholic town, we were approached right away by the neighbors. Be sure you do not cook any meat on Friday.
Right.
Of course, my dad that's exactly what he did on Friday. I looked at all the videos. And
Yeah, try some.
they forbid to marry
Yeah. The priests.
for their priests. And as soon as you walk into the church, you see all the saints lined up, the carved statues and everything, and they pray to them.
Yeah, to the statues, yeah. And you get that though, forbid the priests to marry, but they'll bless gay unions. That's where they are now. Priests, you can't get married, but we'll bless gay unions. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Translations into English, actual translations now. John Wycliffe made the first, this is down at the bottom of your page, the first English translation. He did not make it from the original Greek and Hebrew. He made it from the Latin Vulgate. That's what he had available to him. That's what the Catholics had. That was their translation. Not that that's a bad thing, except that you need to know it was a translation from a translation. So it's like 2 steps removed. Okay, but he translated the Latin Vulgate into English in 1382. The printing press was invented in 1450. We talked about that in an earlier lesson. And the Renaissance, that was a period in history that revived interest in the study of Hebrew and Greek. So people had an interest in digging into this stuff and learning about it. There were scholars that were really interested in this. And these historical events set the stage for further efforts to translate. But Wycliffe made the first translation into English. And going back to my chart here, King James was not the first, okay? By the way, I need to move my chart up here. And I'll move it a step one more. There we go. Wycliffe. We talked about him. Tyndale was the next one, 1525. That's on page 2. I'm looking at my clock here, see what time we got. He translated the New Testament in the year 1525. Due to the Renaissance, the open study and learning type atmosphere, he was able to translate the original Greek and Hebrew. So, whereas Tyndale just translated from the Latin, which was a translation of a translation, this guy's able to go back to the original Hebrew and Greek. Okay, he was refused permission to translate the Bible in England. And he was condemned as a heretic, strangled, and burned at the stake, just to make sure he's good and dead. Just strangle him, and then just to make sure we want to burn him at the stake for translating the Bible into English. This is why this happened to this guy. So that's why I said we need to appreciate, even though these guys may have got us off doctrinally in terms of the Protestant movement, these were also the same people who brought the English Bible into the English language, or brought the Greek Bible into the English language so that we could understand it. So we owe them a debt of gratitude for that, for sure. Miles Coverdale, 1535, he relied upon the guy before him. He relied upon the work of Tyndale. The Matthews Bible, and his name wasn't Matthews, that's what they called his Bible, the Matthews Bible. It's a pseudonym, it's a false name. The guy's name was John Rogers. That's all in your notes there. The year 1537, he's basing his work on the guys that went before him. And so you see how these translations, they're kind of building upon the previous work. And part of that is you've got a good base to go back to. Here's something we can start with. Maybe I can improve it here, maybe I can improve it there. But I got something to start with. It gives me a guideline. See. Then there was something called the Great Bible in 1539. That was a revision of the Matthews Bible. Notice how each of these are building on the others. They're revising the one that went before it. They called it the Great Bible because of its size. The pages were big. Say this one here is about 5.5 by 8.5, okay? But these were 15 inches by 9 inches. That's a big honking Bible. You might have to have two hands to carry that one. That was a big Bible. But it's what a lot of times they call a pulpit Bible. You ever seen a pulpit Bible? They're huge. You know, they're like this thick, and they set up on the pulpit, and they're made for public reading. They've got great big print. That's one of the reasons they're so big. The bigger print Bible you have, the bigger your Bible's going to be. So they have great big print, and they're really, really thick. So this was a big Bible. The Great Bible was called by Miles Coverdale. It was placed in all churches for reading by laymen. That's a term that denominational folk use to distinguish from the clergy. The clergy is the preaching class, and the layman is everybody else. So it was placed in all churches. So you had that big pulpit Bible set out in all these churches. There were some things that came up during this time period. There was the Catholic versus Protestant conflict. Sylvia had introduced earlier about the indulgences. There were a lot of abuses in the Catholic Church. People began to wake up to this. One of the people was Martin Luther. And the Catholic Church, one of the things that really made Martin Luther upset, wasn't the only thing, but one of the things was this called the sale of indulgences. And just to put it in plain English, they wouldn't sell it this way, I'm sure. But to put it in plain English, I think I'm going to go pull a big drunk this weekend. So if I pay the priest $150, he'll just wipe away my sin, and I can just pull a big old drunk and everything will be all right, see. I get to indulge myself. For a certain sum of money, I get to indulge myself in sin. So they had the sale of, that's corrupt. That's as corrupt as it can be. And this is one of the things that tipped the scales for Martin Luther to start his efforts at Reformation. Now, he didn't notice the word Reformation. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He wanted to fix the things that were wrong with it. There were a lot of things wrong. He wanted to fix it. He didn't initially set out to create the Lutheran Church. In fact, he actually said, please don't call yourself Lutherans. He actually said, don't do that. Don't name yourself after me. He actually said that. But, of course, that's not what eventually happened. They ended up calling themselves after his name. But he nailed these, he called them his 95 Theses. Basically, they're debate propositions. 95 issues he had with the Catholic Church, nailed them to the church house door and said, I'll debate these issues with any of y'all if you want to. And that set the thing a-going. Now you got the Catholics mad, them all stirred up. And remember, they still have great power at this time to kill people and have people imprisoned for this kind of stuff. So it's not like just, well, he disagrees with me. This was serious stuff. This was life-threatening stuff. So you have to admire the bravery of men like Martin Luther and others in that same line of thinking who stood up to the power of the Catholic Church. Or we may not be sitting here. We might be sitting here as Catholics if that hadn't happened, because they had great control over things at the time. The Parliament, I'm still reading the list of things during this time period. The Parliament, this is the governing body of England, restricted the English Bible to certain social classes. Okay, so we got an English Bible, but not everybody can read it. So we just want the rich folk to read it, not everybody, okay? Tyndale's work, he was that second translator up at the top of the page there, in his Bible he had a lot of notes. It'd be like what we'd call a study Bible today. You know, I don't like study Bibles, especially for preaching, because all the study notes get in the way. But if you're going to get off in the corner and study, they're good. But for preaching, all the study notes kind of get in your way. But it'd be like a study Bible, and he'd have all these notes, and they were anti-Catholic notes. So that got him in trouble. He's not happy about that. During this time period, 300 Bible students and reformers were martyred. They were put to death for their efforts to translate the Bible and bring it to the common man. So this was not an easy task. It was not just like, let's just do it and it was done. It was done under great opposition and great persecution, and people lost their lives so that you and I could sit here today and have a copy of the Bible in our own language. So we owe them a great debt of gratitude for that. There was I'm still looking at the clock here, the Geneva Bible, made in 1560. It was based on Tyndale and the Great Bible. Again, notice how they're all building on the previous Bibles that have been made. So that gives them a baseline to work from. Then they go back to the original Greek and Hebrew and see if they can make it better, okay? So it was the Geneva Bible. Sometimes the Geneva Bible is called the Britches Bible. Turn your Bibles to Genesis 3 and verse 7. Anybody ever heard of the Britches Bible? In Genesis 3, it's 7. It says, the eyes of both of them were opened. This is after Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves breeches, is what the Britches Bible said. That's the way it was translated. They made coverings for themselves. I think the Hebrew word is basically a loin covering. So it'd be like, what a pair of swimming trunks would cover, or underwear or something like that, as the idea, loincloth, basically. But this Bible translated it breeches. So they called it the Britches Bible. It was a very popular edition. There was a revival a few years ago of this Geneva Bible. I saw people on TV pushing it because there were people wanting to go back and get a copy of that. It was a very popular edition. They went through 140 editions of that Bible. This was the Bible that was used by the Pilgrims. And we talk about the Pilgrims coming over here to escape religious persecution. It was the Bible used by William Shakespeare. It was this Geneva Bible. Notice they didn't use the King James. It hadn't been made yet. But the Pilgrims used the Geneva Bible. William Shakespeare used the Geneva Bible. And this was, here it is right here, the first Bible to have chapters divided into verses. Now prior to this, they probably had chapters. Well, they clearly did. But now they're breaking them down into verses. Those things are put there as a convenience, and thankfully so. So that when I'm standing up here and I say, everybody turn to Isaiah 53:7, then we're all on the same page. And when I start reading, see, that's the reason those are just there for a convenience, for locating a common place so we can all look at the same passage. They're not put there by God, and originally when the Bible was written, they weren't there, those chapter and verse divisions. Okay, I'm looking at the clock. I need to hush right there. We're going to talk about the Douay version next week. That's a Catholic translation, and there was a reason they had to make that. Okay, and we'll talk about that next week.